we'll move now on, thank you, to the next presenter, who is John Chuchiak. John is currently the Dean of the Honors College and the Director of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Hispanic Studies program at Missouri State University. He's a distinguished professor of colonial Latin American history and the holder of the Rich and Doris Young Honors College Endowed Professorship. He received his bachelor's degree in history from Virginia Polytechnic and State University, and his master's and PhD from Tulane University. A corresponding member of both the Mexican Academy of History and the Guatemalan Academy of Geography and History, he's a scholar of the colonial encounter between the Yucatec Maya and Spanish colonization. His research interests include both Spanish colonization in the region and Maya reactions and resistance to the religious, cultural, social, legal, and economic imposition of Spanish colonialism in the region. John's most recent research interests have now turned to the nature of Maya concepts of asymmetrical relationships and dependency in terms of pre-contact and early colonial Maya servitude, slavery, and forced concubinage. John's talk today is titled Libations and Beverages of the Gods, Gender, Foodways, and Ritual Feasting in Colonial Maya Rituals 1527 to 1797. The floor is yours. Please welcome John Chuchiak.
Thank you very much, Harry, Max, and Matt. This is a great honor to be invited to participate with your group. And without further ado, I'm going to take you on a voyage to the past to understand a little bit about colonial Maya conceptions of food, feasting, and the role of women in Maya rituals, especially in terms of liquid libations. We're going to start basically with a little story as usual. There was an interesting series of cases in the region known as the Vicaria of Peto and the cities of Calakmul and Peto in the end of the 16th century in 1598. Some very interesting things occurred at that time period and some fascinating trials, bringing out some evidence of many cultural aspects of this topic. In the house of a noble Francisco Pech and his neighbor, Andres Chin, one evening, a Maya couple started to discuss recent rituals that had occurred. In 1598, more than 56 years after the Spanish conquest of Yucatan, a Maya woman from the town of Peto, Ana Tsuma, engaged in a late afternoon marital dispute with her husband, Juan Tum. The topic of the discussion were the secret meetings and ceremonies being held inside the house of Francisco Pech and that of Andres Chin in the evenings. Now, Juan Tung complained about the secretive nature and told his wife that they shouldn't and don't let anyone else join them. She intently asked her husband, "Do you know how our ancestors made it rain in their cornfields?" Now, Juan Tung did know the answer, but he pretended not to. According to testimonies, he replied, "I do not know." His wife began to lecture him. It was then that Anatsuma remembered forbidden things and told him, "Then I will tell you how they made it rain in their cornfields. They gathered together and they ate and drank and made other ceremonies and offerings so that they would have good weather and good harvest. And this Maria Kimi, the wife of Akin, Andres Chin, told me." The rituals that were occurring in the evenings and also in two specific places, in the apiaries or colmenares of chieftains and nobles of the town and in their homes. Juan Tung responded forcefully, "Oh no, don't even mention these things because they're ancient rites now long past." And his wife responded, "Be quiet and go look for cacao so that we can make cacao pozole. And then we can give it to those who join together at the meetings that Andres Chin holds. Then we too, with this offering, will have a good harvest." After several days of arguments, Juan Tung relented and he went to the secret meetings at his wife's request. That cup of pozole cacao will be costly for him. At a ceremony in honor of two clay idols at the home of Francisco Pech, Juan Tun hesitantly participated and drank a cup of the ritual libation Cacao Pozol, Chuyuha. Unfortunately for him, they're going to be encountered by the ecclesiastical judge of the Episcopal Court, Baltasar de Herrera. Juan Tun would confess that he had participated, but, quote, he did not think that it was a good, and he did not feel good doing it. Tun's wife, Anatsuma, escaped punishment only through death. She died several days before the ceremonies were uncovered by the local priest. What is interesting about this case in Peto and Calakmul is not only did they arrest the arcanist Francisco Pech and Andres Chin, but they confiscated a great number of idols, all of which are described in the trial testimonies. They also confiscated instrumentos de idolatría, including garments and special colors and symbols on them. And they held an auto de fe, kind of like what Landa did, but here in the town of Calakmul in 1598. The judge learned a great deal about Maya food and drink offerings. With this case and hundreds more like it, which occurred before the ecclesiastical courts of the Provisorato de Indios and Yucatan proved, it's the food, and especially ritual drinks and libations, continue to play an essential role in Maya ritual and religious life before and after the conquest. Moreover, Maya concepts of ritual beverages and libations, the creation, their use and offering, was intimately related to Maya concepts of gender and communal social relationships, as Baliev and many of our other colleagues, especially in the Russian school, have shown us, and intimately connected to Maya ideals of the necessity of reciprocal feasting. We're going to hear from Alan as well. In the classic period, we have evidence of these types of drinking vessels in drinking things, long-necked ceramic jars, ollas, similar to the ones described as being confiscated in these series of idolatry trials. But what about food and drink offerings and the sacrifices to these quote-unquote idols or images of Maya gods? Maya idolatry, as the clergy called it, religion, as the Maya would consider it, religio, consisted in the offering of gifts and sacrifices to the images or the idols, as the clergy said, and a petition, and for the gods' favor. We give you, you give us. It's a reciprocal relation with the heavens and with gods. Offerings and other things given in the post-classic and colonial period are a mixture of many of these things that we're going to study. Copal incense, of course, always omnipresent. Cuscas, colored stone or jadeite beads, some of them rounded, others shaped and formed, they were offered as the payment or money of the idols. There was a trade in these things late into the colonial period. Then balche, a mead-like fermented drink made from honey and the bark of the balche tree, Longocarpus, Longestillus, and a whole series of others. And sakah, a drink made out of cornmeal and sweetened with honey. And Carrie Hull and others have written most recently about these things and feasting and their connection. We see evidence of it now with what we're hearing from Clarissa on evidence in the scientific record. Then there is chuyuha, this chocolate pozole or cacao pozole, and other foods and animal sacrifices. And of course, blood offerings, sometimes mixed with food, sometimes given on certain leaves of various plants and trees. All of these were given and offered to the images or idols to appease or persuade the gods and deities they represented. In order to understand Maya religion during the post-classical and colonial period, we must explain these drink and libation offerings and what it meant. Maya gods expected food to be fed and to drink, libations of sacred beverages, in order to provide that sustenance, wah and ha, that the Maya needed. Important ritual food offerings and sacrifices included many things that we saw Clarissa talk about. Tamales filled with dog meat, quail, turkey, deer. The ritual sacrifice of these animals to the images of the gods served as a sacrifice, but also their transformation from the animal product, hunted or trapped, and the ritual preparation involved. Food and drink offerings of the gods remain some of the most important sacrifices. The Yucatec Maya called the term of the offering or sacrifice itself pachi, to open the mouth of the god. The term alone, in combination with the custom of feeding offerings, like the Lacandon still do today, to the idol's mouth, illustrates the significance of food and drink offerings in Maya religion and ritual. Diego de Landa said that they made large offerings of bread and wine and of all the food and drinks which they used. Ritual and religious significance of food and drink offerings cannot be underestimated, as we've seen throughout this whole series of papers and in others as well. Offerings of food and drink propitiated the deities and ensured a good harvest, because Maya believed that if one fed the gods, they could expect the gods in turn to feed them. But what were these beverages in the Maya religious ritual and tradition? Concepts of ritual purity demanded that in the preparation, offering, and the process of making these sacred drinks, purity had to be ensured. Thompson long ago noted, above all for the Maya, they had a need for virgin water, Chuchiak, in rites as a cardinal requirement in carrying out any ceremony. The need for ritual purity, the plates on which they placed the offerings, was Zuhuilak. They were virgin ceramic vessels, which meant they had never previously been used. And even the fire had to be Zuhuilak, or virgin fire, that was kindled for that event at that altar. The making of ritual beverages that were offered to the gods and used as libations for the feasting and ritual purity and the fabrication of drinks can still be observed among the Lacandon, but the colonial Maya, very similar to the Lacandones, had many ritual incantations and preparations of ritual purity. Even the receptacles and gourds and ceramic plates to be used had to be pure and newly made, unused. The most common thing to offer was drink. That was one of the first offerings, and almost omnipresent in every ritual encountered, discovered, or denounced before the ecclesiastical courts for the 300-year period they existed in Yucatan. The priests presented all of these things on new ceramic plates, and idolatry testimony. The same Juana who didn't want to go explains the need for virgin offerings. He well understood the need. His wife, he said, already deceased, knew the ancient rites and ceremonies. Because of her job, it was to prepare the ritual offerings of the drinks and to serve them to the guests, and that thus he took her commands and sought these things. And for the effect, this confessant went out to cut 4 new gourds for the libation, because they had to be new, so that they should not have had anything drunk in them, nor should they have served anything in them before. And that these said 4 gourds of cacao, posol, as a libation offering were called chuyuhach, hanging sacred water. That this is what the ancient idolaters called the sacred libations that served as a sacrifice. And it was done as a sacrifice and hung there so that the sacrifice was sent to heaven. And this is what and how the confessant interprets it. The virgin water of ritual drinks and libations had to come from suyihach, virgin water, from distant cenotes collected in rocks, or the dew of the morning, water off of stalactites and caves. Fray Diego de Landa said that they looked for this virgin water, and they said that it had to be brought from the woods where no woman had been ever penetrated. The women of Maya culture were in the hearth and home, not in the forests, not in the milpas, not in the colmenares. The offering to the gods focused on ritual purity. One case in 1694, one Akin describes a type of incantation to ensure the purity. I am placing the virgin altar before you, Lord Chak. I offer you 13 fresh virgin gourds. I bring them before your majesty, before the holy lords. Lord Zatstun Chak, God of the rain of the east. Atzon Shon Kan Chak, our Lord of the rains of the third heaven. Bolong Kan Chak, Lord of the rains of the ninth heaven. Lelem Kan Chak, Lord God of the rain and lightning. Hop Up Kan Chak, Lord of the rains of the fifth heaven. Many of these terms come to us, and we see them repeated in texts such as the Chilambalames. But what are these libations? In order of sacrality and complexity, the most simple was one that is still used today, sakha, white pozole. Ul, or atole, we see it, and Carrie Hull has studied this, and this is a drawing from David Stewart. White pozole, sakha, was continued to be made from corn dough mixed with sweetened or unsweetened water. For the pre-contact Maya, it was often sweetened with the sacred sweetener of the gods, honey. We will see that honey is included almost always when a gift was to be given to the gods. It could be drunk by man without sweetened, but the gods preferred the beauty of the sweet smell of copal and the sweet drinks and libations. As Carrie Hull has shown us, ethnographic source makes clear that sakah was exclusively a ritual known as the white water of ritual. We saw in the murals of Calakmul briefly earlier today, scenes showing the gruel maize cellar, the sak'ah or the ul, the atole cellar. Common ceremonies to the gods, many of them included corn drink, sak'ah. The Maya often offered the gods both food and libations in the hope that the gods might reciprocate. This corn drink remained one of the most common drinks used by the Maya in all types of ceremonies. The Colonial Motul dictionary calls tzak'ah, and it states, literally, it is atole in the Mexican language, made of water and maize and drunk cold without cooking or heating. Sometimes they mixed cacao with it. The cacique Don Pedro Coyi, he gives us important evidence in the 18th century of the significance of sak'ah in his own rituals. He said that it is true that while being cacique, when he had been found these idols, he hid them as he had declared. And he took them to his milpa and offered them a sacrifice, but only once. And while having them on the ground, hanging in front of them a gourd full of their sacred libation of cooked corn, that they call it sak'ah, he mentions it is cooked. And this he did alone, without having done a genuflection, not really worshiping it. He had not crossed himself, so it could not count as being a worshiping, from an idolatry trial against the cacique in 1721. Several friars ran across an idolatrous ritual of sak'ah in the village of Humalna in the early 17th century, Juan de Estrada and Encillo. The friars complained their Maya assistants had witnessed and performed ceremonies with rebels, in which the rebels from the region of Tipu. One of these apostates was the idolatrous priest of the others. He said mass to them, and with mass his food was tortillas, his drink was maize gruel. It was sak'ah. The other idolatrous Indian said to them, this is indeed a mass and a true sacrifice, which your companions, the Spanish friars, do not do. To give a sacrifice to the god, you must include corn. The importance of corn in ritual food and drink, we started to see it in the archaeological evidence of La Corona. The Maya maize god is seated here with this collocation that is a series of glyphs that literally mean sustenance, food and drink, tiwach, tihach, consumption or sustenance. It's in the codices everywhere. It shows up in idolatry trials as well. The rain god Chak seated on a mat holding the symbols for tortillas and water, probably not hot water, but sweetened water, gifts for the gods. Omnipresent in every single Maya sacrifice. Many times there are not foods, but there are always liquid libations in the documentation. One of the most sacred for the Maya of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, cacao posol, chuyulhach, these hanging gourds of cacao. Another ritual libation were cacao beans whipped into a frothy foaming drink with corn, gruel. Landa described the sacredness of chocolate and cacao, how it was used as money in the pre-conquest period, and it still was incredibly valuable and monetized into the 17th century. Mayas continued to be paid by encomenderos and others, and chocolate beans. It was made of ground maize and cacao, which formed a kind of foaming drink, which is very savory, and with which they celebrate their feasts. And they get cacao, a grease, which resembles butter. And from this and maize, they make this drink. Now, cacao pods and cacao itself is very important. What the second most common liquid libation offered to the Maya gods, some aspect of a drink with cacao. The sacred importance of cacao and its high value as a commodity made this libation a true sacrifice for the Maya, especially commoners who could rarely afford to expend so much cacao for these drinks. These are the drinks of the nobles, of the principales, of the caciques, of the members of the town councils. Cacao posol is still used today by the Maya. They call it ch'eyem as part of their harvest rites and ritual offerings to the gods in the fields and agriculture. This is the chocolate-like atole described in the classic period, still used to the present. So the masa was either white posol or chocolate posol. And you can still go to the marketplaces in Chiapas and even in Merida and find these things. The sweetened cacao, gruel, chabli or chich cacao. Out of maize, they make a delicious food which they celebrate their feasts. From the cacao, they extract a type of grease and butter. It is a steamed, savory drink. And another one is made from the substance of uncooked ground maize, which is also fresh and tasty. We have idolatry trials of women who made these properties and these drinks. Ines Tzu, the young daughter-in-law of Francisco Pech, complained about him waking her up in the middle of the night to make it. She describes in her own testimony, she was made to wake up in the middle of the night in order to grind corn and cacao, in order to make the drink Chuchiak, or cacao pozol, she called it. It was made mostly of corn with the addition of some ground cacao beans. This she testified on the 6th of April, 1598. Now, Pech himself offered this cacao to 3 images that will be important for us: Chak Ahau, Itzamnach, and Ishau Khan. These are the gods of creation, of the rains, of sustenance. And they incensed them with cacao, gave them cacao pozol, and he claimed, according to witnesses who saw him offer, "My lords, we offer this sacrifice, and I prostrate myself. I place myself underneath your hands, underneath your feet. Send us rain and provide for us all that is necessary." Cacao was a fitting tribute to the gods. The trees themselves were literally cash on the tree, so a great sacrifice. The beans themselves continued to be used as trade currency throughout the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century. It was a valuable commodity, even sought out by the Spaniards. We see, and we saw earlier, we probably have a frothing little bowl here of cacao pozol being offered in the classic period. Maya diving gods, who are also related to honey as well as balche, are often shown with cacao pods, showing that the sweetened drink of cacao was pleasant to the gods of the bees. Post-classic vessel here, said to be from the vicinity of Tulu'u. Maya diving gods appear to be associated with cacao, with honey, and with ritual libations like balche. An excellent work recently by Sylvia Boucher and Peter Biro and Eduardo Heredia. We see an identification of many mural aspects, which I've been building upon in my own research. The Dresden Codex, images of the deity Itzamna holding a frothing cacao drink. Then there are some other incense burners from the greater region, which shows the significance of women and cacao preparation, preparing cacao for a ritual. The Dresden Codex shows the god of corn having an offering of cacao pods. Very often we see deities in the codices carrying or utilizing cacao. One receptacle made of to look like a cacao pod probably once contained cacao offerings or cacao drinks. The rain god Chak seated holding a vessel which probably contains the toasted beans of cacao. We know it's cacao because it mentions in the text cacao. The underworld god Kisin is seated also with cacao pods. It too labels it as cacao. Cacao was also a ritual drink of purity. Landa describes one ritual in which afterwards, without saying a word, he wet the bone in a vessel of water that he had in his hand, and he anointed them on their foreheads, their faces, and between the fingers and toes of the children, the hands and feet, who they conducted this ritual for. They made this water out of certain flowers and cacao dissolved into virgin water, as they called it, brought from the water collected in the hollows of trees or the crevices of stones in the forest. And this flower, we find out in another, is plumeria, which was used to make the cacao fragrant. So chuyuha, cacao pozol, and sakach. But then there is a fermented liquor that is of utmost significance for the Yucatec Maya and to the present day, balche. I served as a basically assistant learning from the Ahmed Don Marcelino Mott from the town of Sanakat quite a bit about the process of balche making, as well as several rituals over the period of the late 1990s. The most important religious rituals all had the use of the ritual intoxicant balche. The Maya made the ritual intoxicant from the bark of the balche tree, Longicarpus violaceus pitier, and the Spaniards called it pitier, pitarilla, they said. It combined it with honey and allowed the drink to ferment during ritual periods of 4 days. According to ethnic oracle sources, the rituals of Balche remained a common feature of colonial Maya religion, but they also added psychotropic elements occasionally, including even certain toads that were left to die and mix in with the Balche in the Quechí region and other places further south of Yucatan. Fray Diego de Landa wrote, they make wine of honey and water and a certain root bark of a tree, which they cultivate for this purpose, by which the wine was made strong and stinking. All the Europeans complain about the smell, which is why they often perfumed it with fragrant flowers. Another friar of the 17th century reports, he was an ecclesiastical judge with commission from the bishop, that Balche was a drink that was made from the bark of the tree Balche, and they make it by soaking this bark for several days in water in several wooden casks. And afterwards, in order to ferment the drink, they add more water and honey. And after another period of several days, they put this drink into large jugs called haltunes, not chaltunes, he called them haltunes. And then they take and use it as a libation to their demons. Ceramic containers that apparently, we'll show you later on, have Balche imagery associated with them are similar to those excavated in Mayapan that Marilyn Masson and others in her group have done over the years, and Carlos Peraza. The Catholic clergy and ecclesiastical judges associated the ritual intoxicant Balche more with idolatry than any other liquid or food offering. The mere presence of Balche was a tacit proof of idolatry. The use of Balche as an offering to the gods usually involved the ritual inebriation of the participants who drank the Balche and became drunk, drunkards. In the town of Chunhuhup, as late as the 18th century, the priests were complaining. In their harvest ceremonies, they basically put this drink they call saka and another they call Balche, with which they get drunk, offering a bread they call nohwah, the big bread, in the thanksgiving to the gods of the milpas named Tzachpacaptun, Chakpacaptun, and Ekpacaptun. These are the Powhatunes. 1784. They believe so much in this damnable vice that when they go to the mountain to cut honey, they burn copal watching the smoke, and they follow its direction as they have it as a very sure thing that in that direction later, they will find a lot of honey. The Maya first offered any ritual libation hanging before the altar place with the gods, and eventually they would anoint the lips and mouth of the gods. According to one trial record in the 17th century, I am offering a gift of Balche. I am pouring it out upon your mouth, upon your lips, an offering of Balche I'm giving you. Come down and receive it. This is very similar to what the Lacandos say. This was from the ecclesiastical judge records of a trial in the town of Quil in 1694, where the ritual incantation was said. But so too did the Lacandon, who are basically the descendants of many Maya who fled the northern territories and mixed in with other groups from Quechachis and others from the Petén and from the regions on the border of Spanish colonialism. Tauzer comments on a similar invocation to the gods and a typical offering of Balche to the Lacandon's god pots, like Milan Kovac and others have researched. The Lacandon say similar words when he pours out a little Balche on the face of the pots. In an earlier description, Geraldo Díaz del Puche, the Spanish encomendero from the town of Tzonot, who lived among the Maya, wrote that, quote, they made a type of wine out of water and honey, and they threw it into a root called Balche in their language. And they made it in several large wooden containers, like large casks. And they added to the mixture from 20 to 30 and even 50 arrobas of water. And they cooked it and boiled it there for 2 days. And it made a very strong drink, which smelled very bad. And in their dances and ceremonies, they gave all the participants small cups of this Balche to drink. In a very short time, they all became drunk. The Balche tree is fragrant, beautiful flowers, and seed pods that are endemic. Representations of Balche in the codices. The first Franciscan friars attempted to outlaw the production, the use of the ritual intoxicant, much to the Maya's consternation. They even ordered that the trees be destroyed if they were found. Regardless of these prohibitions and the extirpators' best attempts, they could not root out Balche as its continued use among the Lacandon and the modern Maya shows us. There are people who have studied additives that had been summarized, described, or tested, added to balche. The archaeological, ethnohistorical, and ethnographic information makes it clear that balche has long been a drink to which various other more potent psychoactive substances were added, which led to the increased potentiator of the alcoholic effect and a narcotic effect. This has been considerable speculation about what other substances. We know, and I saw myself, that the plumeria flower with Don Marcelino was added to make the balche drink fragrant, to take away that bad stench the Spaniards complained of. But also there is evidence that Nymphea amplia, or the water lily, was added to balche or pulque sometimes. A report from the colonial period states that the roots of the maguey agave were sometimes added to balche in the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. The white water lily in the classic period and into the books of Chilam Balam is associated with balche and honey rituals. Fronds of water lily plants surround emerging deities in these ceramic vases from the classic period. And there is a water lily monster that occasionally shows up, usually also in cacao vessels, interestingly enough. Drinking the ritual libation with the water lily envelops the drinker in the wine, according to what Don Marcelino told me years ago. The balche bark itself was what they used, not the root, as many of the Europeans thought. It was the bark that they used. Balche bark was harvested, traded, and there was an underground network of its trade in the colonial period. It was essential to make balche and still remains essential. Illicit trade was controlled by certain elders in towns. The bark of the balche tree that makes the said drink, they bring it from the town of Mopila. They rode outside of Merida at the Rancho de Santa Catalina, and they sell it to the others. And those who do it are Ahchuntan Kowoch, Ahchuntan Pol. These are the speakers, the elders of the town, natives of Santa Catalina, who are the sellers and merchants of these balche bark shavings, and who go to look for them in different towns because it is not easy to find them here close to Merida. We know from more than a dozen trials that this illicit trade focused on two main regions. They were on the very edges of Spanish colonization, where they had not been able to destroy these trees if they find them. The region of Mopila, from Mopila to the east, and from Ichmul to the east, west, and south. And there is trade among the Petén, Itza, and border regions in Oshkutskap, in Mani, throughout the 16th and 17th century. It is the fear of losing balche that drove the Maya to this. They shall come to demand of us our government, those things that we hold sacred, precious stones, precious beads, and they shall demand the planted wine, the balche. Very rightly they worshipped as true gods these idols and precious stones. In the esoteric language of the Chilam Balam, cryptic language known as the lenguaje de Tsuyua, the language of purity, really, the ritual drink is analogous with women and the goddess Ishaukan, as well as her daughter. Her daughter is Balche. This comes out in another idolatry trial. If we take apart this Chilam Balam description of what code or what secret language is used to describe Balche, it's fascinating. This is the green blood. It is the Balche wine. These are the entrails of the daughter. They are the empty jobones, because they've taken the honey out to make balche. This is his daughter's head. It is an empty receptacle, soon to be used to steep the wine. These are the interesting things. Unused jar, virgin. This is what his daughter's green stool, her excrement, is. It is the stone pestle for honey that looks like a piece of excrement. This is what the left ear of the wild bee is. It is the moisture, the dew of the balche wine. This is what the bone of his daughter is. It is the flexible bark of the balche. And this is what he speaks when he says the thigh of the daughter of Shebelyash is the trunk of the balche tree. This is what the arm of this daughter is. It is the branch of the balche. And this is what he calls weeping. It is drunken speech, the Chilam Balam scribes note. The balche drink is associated with the origin of the world. We see this in various idolatry trials among the Lacandon and in the books of Chilambalam. The first god or gods were the Ahmuts and Kab, the honey collectors, bee deities. During the creation of the world, the balche drink was reborn, this wonderfully polychromed vase. If you look at the little concentric circles, we're going to come back to that. Remember this vase and the circles around the headdress, the circles on the wrists and the ankles. In the Maya creation myth in the book of Chilambam of Chumael, the divine origins of the drink and the plants associated with it are noted. The Lord of Katun 11 Ahau released his bees. Then came the word of Bolon Tsakab, the 9 descended from the tip of his tongue. Then the burden of the Katun was searched for. 9-fold is its burden. Then it came from heaven. Khan is the day in which his burden is bound. The water came out. It came out of the heart of heaven, the sacred first water, Balche. And we'll see that this is equivalent to Bolon Mayel, which is an equivalent of the Aztec goddess of Pulque, in ritual inebriation. Sweet was his mouth and the tip of his tongue. Sweet too was his brain. It was sweetened with the honey of Balche. The judge provisor, Don Agustin Francisco Chano, as late as the 1760s, continued to mandate the destruction and the stopping of the balche trade. You should place much caution, he wrote to his judges, and be efficient in prohibiting the dangerous beverage called balche, impeding totally the cutting and trade of the bark of this tree, so that on no pretext will the Indians have access to it. This is to be done because this drink is very prejudicial for the true conversion of these natives, and it is their drinking that hinders them from becoming good Christians. In Yashkaba, as late as 1813, true failure is made obvious. Balche consumption continued, but became more clandestine. Bartolome Jose Granado Baeza, the judge of Yashkaba, the ecclesiastical judge and vicario, in response to a series of questions by the bishop, exasperated with the trials that he was conducting, dozens of them, he gave intimate details. A table is built for its celebration, on which offerings of different foodstuffs are placed. A sacrificed turkey, bread, or corn tortillas, he would write and say. These were all offered, as well as jicaras, bowls, and pitaria, the drink prepared from the bark of the balche, dried in the sun and fermented with honey. And then the priest burns the copal as incense. He later goes on to continue when the bishop's questionnaire asked him. He said they believe that this balche is, quote, the first water, the first liquor, just like we see in the Chilambalam text. And in its creation and use, they believe they're recreating the acts of creation of the gods, who they believe are the patrons of balche, the creator pair, the Lord and Lady of Heaven. They are the libations to the gods of creation. He also indicates the ceremony begins with prayers, followed by, quote, the Akin sprinkling the balche offering to the 4 winds, invoking the 4 Pauhatunes, who are lords or guardians of the rains. And they do this by using a sprinkler moistened in the holy liquor of the jicaras, like Landa tells us in the 16th century. The ceremony concludes with the ingestion of the food and the drink by the participants. In all of these beverages, the central role of honey is absolutely essential. In all 3 of the major ritual drinks offered, the Maya added honey. Balche itself was made from fermented honey. Chuyuha was often added with sweetener of honey, especially in the feast and the rituals to the beehives. Always, honey was added when the cacao was offered to the musenkaps. Honey and beeswax were a valuable product, both before and after. Itzamna here is seated with honeycombs in one hand and a beehive in the other, the hobones. The beehive, or the apiary, rests on a stone platform, and there's a curved implement or a strand of honey dripping out of it as he holds up the honeycomb. This is very similar to the way modern apicuristas, or those who traditionally use Maya honeycombs, we see that they come out when they are removed carefully from the hobon, from the beehive. They come out just like the image we see of this aged goddess Ishchebelash, or Ishtzak-Tab, another name for Ishchebelash, the white lady of the land or of the honey. And we see the hobones, wooden hobones with the symbols of honey on it. To the lower right of the god Chak, we see a vessel that also has Kab, or symbols of the frothing honey drink being offered along with food, tortillas, and even 3 skulls in a jar as a sacrificial offering. Itzamna is pictured holding a beehive, and the Maya called these beehives hobon, hollowed out wood above a stone. A bee god hovers in the air above the hive. Traditionally, the Maya have placed sometimes up to hundreds of these hobones under a thatched roof structure to protect the bee colonies. Many of our colleagues, especially in Nakum, have discovered evidence of ceramic beehives. And in those ceramic beehives, surrounded by 9 lords, just like the 9 lords in the Chilambalam, are 9 heads that appear to have female deity images. Many of them appear to have this twisted, knotted cord on their head. We'll talk about that later. But the traditional apicoristas, those who take care of the Maya bees today, engage in the exact same traditions as their ancestors. The rain god Chak here is placing a beehive on the stone with a new colony. The colmenares, or apiaries, were commented upon by the Europeans. The Spanish accounts describe apiaries of great number of hives that have been recorded, more so than even in modern times. The Spaniards, primarily the chronicler Fernandez de Oviedo, described, quote, apiaries with 1,000 to 2,000 hives and trunks of trees, well made with their openings and entrances. The extremes were plugged with the stone for each end. In the archaeological record, what we have left are piles of these stones whenever there's evidence of an apiary. A traditional Maya apiary from the early 20th century shows hundreds of hobones being stacked upon each other in basically a diagonal process of leaning them forward. In the idolatry trial of Don Pedro Coyi, he had more than 160 hobones and his colmenares. He was accused of being a cacique idolatra, and he traded in honey, 160 beehives, más de 160 colmenas were confiscated from him. These beehives were placed in hollow logs. Sometimes the Maya would find hollow logs in the forest, and they would cut them and take the colony with them, or they made them. Both ends are capped with wood or stone stoppers. They call them panuchos today, like the food of Yucatan that you can buy, and they're stacked one on top of another, like you see here. Even today, the same form that is described in the colonial accounts is still being used. They plug them up and they can remove the plug. Sometimes it's mud, other times it's stone or wood. The gods of the hives, Ahmus and Kab, or Hopnil, the Beehive Ceremonies. A bee god from the classical period. There are gods and goddesses that share similarities to what we're going to see in the idolatry trials of the 16th through 18th centuries. Beekeeping in the hives show up in many of the codices. The word Hopnil in the dictionary of Matul basically means the hollow place or the hollow thing. It's the term used for beehives in Yucatec Maya. The Maya similarly associated these Ahmus and Kabs, these gods of the apiaries, with sacred colors and directions. The stages involved in offerings of the cycles of the maintenance can be found in the Madrid Codex. Redfield noticed in his own ethnographic work in the Maya region that bees are handled with some circumspection. In removing the honey, care is taken not to injure or kill the insects. If a bee becomes honey-soaked, it is dried and freed. If one is killed, it is buried in a bit of leaf. This is because the bees are under the protection of certain deities who watch over them and become angered if their wards are not treated properly. In the codices, we see the god Itzamna, dressed as a Maya priest, or Achikin, approaching the colmena, the hive, the hobon. The Shunam Kab, these stingless bees in a wood hobon. In the center of the hives, they are marked with a cross, but this is pre-Hispanic. It's not a Christian cross because it exists in pre-Hispanic pottery associated with hobones and the Maya beads. It's the place through which the 4 corners, the musamkabes of the 4 directions, go in and out of the hive. This cross symbol, and sometimes a square right below it. The square was the 4 points where the protectors of the hive reside. Today, the Maya call them balamob. There are these jaguars that hide these spirits to protect the hives. They're protective spirits, forbid the entrance of bad spirits and winds to kill the bee colony. In the colonial period, Fray Josef Ortiz in 1663, commissary judge of the Franciscan order who got permission by the bishop, conducted several of his trials against people in colmenares and apiaries. The native use a type of hollowed logs called hobones, in which they deposit the colonies of their stingless bees. These hollow logs are then closed and a single opening is left in the form of what appears to be a cross. And this cross is a symbol of their demon, Muzenkab, whose name means variously the great god of the hives or the great guardian of the honey, wrote Fray Josef Ortiz. Effigy censers with the diving god holding Maya beeswax with symbols of round hobones on the side of the incense cannot be more diagnostic. In 1679, in the region of Ashkutskap, one of the judges there, who was a secular clergy sent to a Franciscan region, described that the idols they confiscated, one was of the god of honey and wine, called Muzenkab, who grasped hold of flowers and honeycombs, and is made as if he was a bee descending into the hive. They talk about these descending gods. The whole process of beekeeping, from filling the hobon with a colony to resting and keeping it, protecting it, to gradually offering to it through a series of times to the beehives, is all in the beehive and beekeeping almanacs and the surviving codices. The description of the colors of the gods of the Muzenkaps. The red ceiba tree of abundance is the red Muzenkap, his tree, which is in the east. The white flint stone is the stone of the north. The white ceiba tree is the tree of the white Muzenkap. The black flint stone is the stone of the west, and the yellow flint stone is the stone of the south. These are in the Chulambalam, but there are evidence of painted panuchos or painted tops of various hobones. Muzenkap had a central aspect just like Chak and the Pawatunes. There was Noh Yum Kap, great lord of the hive, who was in the very center position. There are the four directions and a center, larger image. Even among modern Yucatec Maya beekeepers, Muzenkap is still offered sacrifices in order to protect the beehives and ensure an abundance of honey. He's believed to descend from the heaven to drink the sweet nectar of the balche that is offered to him. In the classic period, we see bees associated with rituals which occur at night and a god of drunkenness who frequently has bee imagery around him. Akan. Nikolai Grube was one of the first to really go into depth to describe A prime or Akan, the god of balche, drink. The Maya dedicated special ceremonies to these gods and the beekeepers. In the month of Mol, the beekeepers celebrated another festival, like that which they celebrated in the month of Tzek, in order that the gods, the Muzenkap, should provide flowers for the bees. These beehives and others, the wax, everything that was brought out was sacred of these hobones. The description of these things, the Muzenkabes, are in several cases, including the prominent Maya lord Don Pedro Chiap of Santa Catalina, and the entire town council was found to be hosting drinking festivals during the honey harvesting time. Throughout the colonial period, extirpators discovered numerous ceremonies in honor of these Muzenkabes. They continued. Ritual significance of honey and fermented intoxicant balche was essential, and evidence of their continued worship exists even today. But now I want to dig deeper into who were these gods of drunkenness. The female deity Ishchebelyash, goddess O, shell house, and Akan are two of these gods related to aspects of honey and ritual fermented drinking. From the frescoes of Tulum, as I mentioned earlier, the work of Pedro Biro and Heredia and Boucher have an excellent analysis of some of the murals, and I completely agree because it matches a lot of what's happening in these idolatry trials. An image of this goddess, Ishchebelyash, who invariably is called either Ishchebelias, if they misunderstand it, Ishchebelyash, or Ishahaukan. She is the consort of Itzamna. She and Itzamna are the heavenly creators. The center of heaven, they are Tan Yol Kan. They are in the center of heaven. Both she, Ishchebelyash, and Itzamna. They are the creator pair, and they're intimately connected to ritual drinking on the classic Maya vessels into the modern trials to the late 18th and 19th century. Her idol and image is often used, worshipped, and given balche and honey and other ritual libations in these trials. A female version of Itzamna, Ish Chebelyash, known as Chakchel in the classic period, is seated, holding an unidentified object here in her hand. She wears a coiled serpent headdress and a spindle of cotton in her hair. Ish Chebelyash is associated both with rituals involving libations of cacao, posol, and fermented honey balche. The 17th century friar, Fray Diego Lopez de Coyulo, who was also a commissary judge of the Provisoriato, described Itzamna as the inventor of the characters that served as the letters for the Indians. He also notes his female consort was represented by another idol whose figure was of a female inventor of painting and of interweaving figures into the clothes they wore. For this they worshipped her, and they called her Ish Chebel Yash. He knows these because he was involved in 2 trials in which they uncovered these images. So his list of idols comes from his personal experience of being a commissary judge. Balche is in the imagery of these murals, and it is connected to this goddess. The balche tree bears its seed pods from April to June, before the rainy season begins in Yucatan. These seed pods are actually seen on and in the figure of this goddess. The pods themselves, as well as the flowers of the balche. The flowers of balche are seen in the images of these murals. Balche is being offered. The flowers and their seeds and other things are shown in the murals with this goddess. As early as 1562, it's documented that several Mayas offered a sacrifice of a dog and copious amounts of balche to the image of Itzamna and his wife Ish Chebelyash in order to procure rain and the health of a cacique. Later in 1598, another group of Mayas worshipped the same images of Itzamna, along with the image of his consort Ixahaucan, as well as a rain god and other creative deities like the Pauatunes in ceremonies to achieve a bountiful harvest of corn. One of the Mayas arrested in 1598 described the idol he hid in his own milpa as Ixahaucan, necessitated she had to have an offering of balche, because she was one of those who worshipped as, quote, creator of human life, patroness of rain, agriculture, and apiculture. According to the Maya belief of the duality of God, she could either bring divine, benign water or malignant floods. Her image in the codices is often malignant. According to iconographic evidence in Maya testimonies and numerous idolatry trials, this goddess Ixahaucan, the elderly goddess was also associated with ritual drinking of fermented drinks with balche and pulque, which the Maya always offered to her, especially to propitiate her when she was angry, when there was a hurricane or flood. Some floods and hurricanes and droughts saw her specifically being targeted for libation offerings. In the region of Peto, 6 of the idolaters had images of this goddess, an elderly goddess with these images. They also all had images of Chak, which on his person had similar iconography with this goddess. They also described that in the hands of some of these Chak images, they contained ceramic images. One young Indian boy who spilled the beans described that what he held in his hand was a balche container. And we see the Musencabs in Tulum carrying a simple type of ceramic vessel used for balche. We have even Itzamna's messenger, making it even clearer the connection between this goddess and Itzamna. Here is Itzamye, his bird messenger. Here she is, Ixahaucan or Ish Chebelyash, sitting on a throne with alligator-like pedestals, which have Itzamna eyes, giving the ritual implements and symbols, even of the knotted cord that is often on her head, to the god Chak. And we see these things here. We also see that she is the bearer of the rain god Chak and his many aspects. There are also hints in the imagery that Itzamna are omnipresent, even though not physically drawn in these murals. So the colonial Maya and the post-classic believed that the balche tree and inebriation were both associated with the goddess of creation and the god of creation. And their iconographic and ritual elements are connected to drinking and balche. The flowers, the pods of the tree, the bark, all were essential. And you can see this in these images. Female attendants of ritual drinking events, we're going to see, wear garments associated with balche trees and flowers. These appear everywhere. There's balche symbolism all over the murals. Even in classic pots, which we have not really identified completely, perhaps show us that Atole had the addition of balche. Why? Because there apparently are seed pods very similar to what we see at Tulum, as well as flowering, as well as the water lily symbol that shows up at Tulum and also on these pots carrying ritual liquor. The pots filled with balche, where this balche is steeped, are important. And one of them, we see an exact example of what's coming out of this receptacle, the pods and flowers of the balche tree. The circular symbol with concentric circle in the middle appears frequently on ceramic jars for libation offerings of ritual drinks. There's another symbol that appears in receptacles and is described as being placed upon garments confiscated from women who worked in these idolatrous rituals inside the homes of caciques and nobles. This symbol, an iconographic element, is significant as it appears with other floral designs repeated on balche tree imagery and on garments of what I will talk about briefly towards the end here about ritual attendants, cupbearers, I call them. There is a word that the idolatry tribes tell us that they're called. Drinking rituals inside houses or palaces in many ceramic images. So all of this tells us that the word balche actually has two meanings that are interchangeable. Balche could be the tree, but the word bal, the root of it, is bending, knotting, or twisting threads or strands, or the contents of something. In referring to the tree Longicarpus longistilis, the che classifier for tree in the Yucatec Maya, balche, árbol, de que hacen vino y se emborrachaban los indios. But in the colonial Calpino Matul, the word balche right below is also to the string with which the Indians tie their fabrics, or the knotted cords they use to tie up their cloth or their headbands. This is balche, un cordel con que las indias atan o se juntan juntos en hilo para tejerlas y atar la tela con estas cordeles. The goddess Ixchebelias or Ixaocan often is portrayed with these knotted cords, which could be euphemistically referring not only to her goddess of patronage of textiles, but also as her patronage and use of balche. We see that. And we see images of other goddesses that are elderly and share similarities with her, that are associated with balche and pulque, honey-based liquors. So she could, in fact, be telling us with her knotted cords that she is making reference to balche, as the cords show up on the tree with balche imagery. So she's not only the patroness of women's textiles, it is probable that she is also a ritual assistant for her husband Itzamna and ritual drinking of the inebriant balche. Elder Maya women could engage in ritual drinking, not in public except for rare occasions, but in the houses where it was their domain, the house and hearth. This symbol, the symbol we see also on her and in and around balche ceremonies, might be a hint of what is being contained in these even classic containers. This is why I had a question about balche and evidence at La Corona. One image, interesting description, matches a surviving goddess effigy censer. In 1598, an image of the goddess Ixaocan were conducted a ritual by Akin Francisco Pech. Pech gave the sacrifices and offerings to the idols, giving them to eat and drink of the offering, proclaiming, this sacrifice that we offer is for our lords, Chak Ahau, Kin Popoltun, Kin Zapahtun, who are our protectors, who are those who give us life and bring the rains and sustenance. And also we offer it to those who meet our necessities, Kin Kolop Owichin, and the other gods, such as Ixaocan. Ixchebelias or Ixaocan painted red, a color associated with balche trees when they're flowering and seated on a glyph. Older goddess figurines found in connection with honey as well as jobones, such as this image here, share the images of Ixchebelias, Ixaocan, and she even wears a necklace of a jobon, one of these honey beehives. descriptions of idols offered to. The friars in the 17th century even encountered a mestizo man, Juan de Bilbao, along with his Maya wife, worshiping an idol of a female deity with others gathered in their home. The friars described the ritual. They became drunk in front of it with the drink called balche, and he had made a shrine to the idol of this Indian woman, and they reveled in drinking this intoxicating wine in front of her. There are other images that might be images of effigy censers of her, such as the image we found near Lamanai, where she has this tied, knotted cord. On both of these, her similar type of facial features, but there might even be balche pod images like we see in the murals of Tulum on these censers, and they are described in some of the trials. One confession, a man confessed the worship of a clay idol in the image of the goddess of heaven, the consort of Itzamna, and the colmenar, or apiary of Don Francisco Pech, a ritual for balche and honey. This confessant witnessed in the milpa of the said Francisco Pech that he had a clay idol, which was called Ishahaukan, and that the said Akin Pech offered to the said idol 3 offerings of copal in the presence of this confessant, and that when he offered the said incense, he spoke between his teeth, so that this confessor did not understand the words the said Francisco Pech spoke. Afterwards, in her adoration, both consumed the balche and the hanging offering gourds before her. Ishchebelyash in the classic period, an image that may be her, is shown engaging in the vomiting we heard earlier and in ritual drinking. She is an attendant to the gods or the nobles who are engaged in ritual purging after having drunk these stupefying libations. We see drinking imagery of her and the god Akan, god A prime, who's associated with drinking, pulque and balche. There's a symbol that I want to talk more about, the symbol of Akan. This god of drunkenness has a symbol that shows up in some very rare places. The symbols of Akan appear in the garments of noble women, who are to be serving as what I'll call cupbearers, attendants to those involved in rituals. This wonderful polychrome piece has a woman who's wearing these symbols, which appear with females engaged in presenting or offering liquid beverages. This imagery of Akan, or of the goddess, shows that the goddess is wearing black, which associates itself with dark and the god Akan, and some of these round concentric circle symbols. Interesting, isn't it? Some of these symbols are described as being painted on the wooden beams of houses. And one of the cases of idolatry in the mid-17th century, they found them in the house, painting little concentric circles with red, as if it was a blood offering, on the beams of the house inside, as well as on their clothing, as well as on their persons. These symbols mean something. At Tulum, Ishchebelyash is present together with Ahmus and Kab and murals relating to drinking of honey, but so is Akan. The god Akan arrives usually with cotton cloths, honey or balche, and his pot, like that cotton, the cacao pot we saw that has a twist-off lid, very similar to what we see here. Images of darkness or of bees are on his vessels. The god Akan is shown in many instances. Beehive ceremonies took place mostly at night, and many reports, both in colonial documentation and among the Lacandon, report similar red coloring for balche rituals. The use of concentric circles painted in red with a dot in the center associated with balche and ritual intoxication. The term the clergy used in the dictionaries was nighttime sin, ukeban akab, pecados que se hacen de noche, como convites, bebidas y bailes. Is what the Motul Friars Dictionary tells us. The Maya god of ritualized drinking is often shown with his symbols, the percent symbol of god A prime or Akan, his name in several instances as well. He's shown drinking, engaging in ritual of mage, of pulque, of what is probably balche, and with bees. Here he's shown with a pot of darkness where he's spilling out the bees and no like sacred honey. But what about the concepts of gender in drinking that we're going to end this with? Well, religion, Maya religion, and the women's inherent impurity in ritual context has been a frequent topic of discussion among colonial and modern ethnographers. The supposed ritual impurity of women prohibited their participation and attendance in many of the Maya religious ceremonies held in temples, in the cornfields, in the beehives. However, as we'll see, women were rooted in the home and hearth. Those rituals and feasts that occurred in the homes of prominent Maya men were hosted and saw the participation of women. It's interesting to note, of the hundreds of trials I have documented evidence for, no common Maya people had women doing this in their homes. These are all nobles of lineage, Almejeno, who have their women engaging in these things, even in the house. There's no clearer division can we see in this distinction in the Maya separation between ritual drinking feasts in the homes of the caciques and lords, where noble women played an important role, and the milpas, forests and beehives, where women were ritually considered outsiders and impure. Only on rare occasion would there ever be a woman caught in one of these rituals outside of the home. This gendered world of drinking rituals is evident in the classical Maya iconography and in the ethno-historical sources. Maya women in ritual drinking, I'm going to argue for a position, and we have evidence for it, of official cupbearers in the domestic sphere, just like the goddess Ishchebelyash is the cupbearer and the assistant to Itzamna's ritual drinking. So were the noble wives to their husbands. Even in classic Maya iconography imagery, most of the drinking scenes represented inside palace or household spaces saw women present and playing a prominent role. But those outside or are not bound by a constructed space rarely, if ever, have representations of women engage in ritual drinking. While they still made these ritual libations or aided in the production, they did not partake in the ceremonies, dances, or rituals, especially if they were in their childbearing years. Older women like Goddess O, however, did often participate in public rituals and temples. Younger women were prohibited. But younger women had the duty of making the ritual food and drink preparations. Noble women in their roles in ritual food and drink offerings are described by Landa. They were very devout and caretakers of idols and images, and because of this, they had many acts of devotion with their idols, burning incense to them, offering them gifts of cotton clothing, food, drinks, and fearing them. It was their job to make the offerings of food and drink that they offered during the festivals of the Indians. But with all of this, they did not have the habit of shedding their blood to the demons. This they never did, nor did they allow them to go to the temples or the sacrifices, except on a certain festival at which they admitted certain old women for its celebration. In an idolatry trial in the case against Andres Chim, we find out that Anakimi, the wife of Juan Na, grinds and makes the sacrifices of posol to offer to the said idols. And she serves the men balche and posol cacao, and she drinks and eats together with them of the said sacrifices in the house of Andres Chim. Women shown grinding, mostly, no doubt, cacao, as we see in this image here, are described doing the same thing in the colonial period. They're serving as ritual cupbearers in attendance to these ritual drinking festivals inside the home. It was in the domestic sphere, especially places of residence of nobles and principales, that women played a central role in the creation, the elaboration, and even the celebration of household drinking rituals and feasts. Outside in the milpas and the beehives, women's presence was strictly and ritually limited. Drunkenness, too, was more permissible among the elderly women than among younger women who had prohibitions against drunkenness. As Landa notes, the cupbearers, mostly women in the homes and palaces, did not get drunk, but were responsible for serving and taking care of their drunk male relatives, unless they wore certain garments, as we will see. They had the habit of turning their backs on the men whenever they met them anywhere, of stepping aside to let them pass. They did the same when they gave them drink until they had finished drinking. At these drunken orgies, drinking was frequently carried to such an excess that the wives of the guests were obliged to come for their besotted husbands and drag them home. Many times they sat behind them, trying to moderate them in their drunkenness. There is a position of cupbearers and ritual servant attendants. In the idolatry trial, in one case, we actually have the word for it, ish tanlachtach, someone who serves or offers or gives. a cupbearer, a ritual assistant. A cupbearer was historically in most world cultures an officer of high rank in a royal court whose duty was to pour and serve the drinks at the royal table. Iconographic and ethnohistorical evidence of the role of Maya women and ritual cupbearers exists and shows the gendered nature of a ritual dichotomy of household versus field and forest. At these feasts, Landa wrote, beautiful women served the drink, and after giving the cup, they turned their backs on the person who took it until the cup is emptied, and they served them again. According to several examples of idolatry trials, it appears that women who made and served ritual drinks to the men in their drinking rituals in the homes of nobles had a title, Ishtanlachta, official position of noble Maya women who serve and take care of prominent guests who engage in balche drinking rituals. The women gave to each of those who danced and sang a small cup of balche. Juan Farfan participated in several of these with the chieftains of his encomienda town. They gave it to them so frequently that they became drunk, and with it they did and said so many extravagant things and made such grimaces that it was a sight to behold. Notice that this woman is wearing the percent symbol of the drunk god Akan, and women wearing special garments with concentric circle symbols of Akan or Ishahokan are shown always with their husbands, preparing them for drink, stepping and setting behind them, or offering them in the process of giving them materials for an enema or for a drink. Oftentimes we see Maya vessels where women are wearing water lily imagery and wearing garments that have that same iconographical symbols we've seen associated with ritual libations of balche and pulque and other sacred libations. They are mostly seen in palace scenes inside in the company of men, sometimes musicians or rituals, many times the gods and the pawatunes. These symbols of Akan we showed before show up with these women. And the cupbearers, the Ishtanlachta, will have special garments. Here's a woman wearing the exact same thing that little polychrome ceramic figurine is wearing. She's in the same figure. She's offering ritual drink. She, no doubt, represented this goddess Ashaukan and the god of their balche Akan. And we have an idolatry trial that basically tells us this is what they are doing. And the wife of Wana, called Anakimi, is the one who makes the posol and the cacao of the sacrifices called Chuchiak. And that also, for the effect, the said Anakimi is called to the house of the said Akin Francisco Pech, when the said rites and ceremonies are to be done with the said posol cacao. And that as such, she serves as an official to whom they entrust the preparation of the drinks, and she's also serves the guest as their ishtanlacha, their server, their provider. She is respected and honored by those of the said feast, and she drinks from the said sacrifices. She receives cacao payment, just like the Akines. She is a ritual assistant. This is something that is fascinating and that is not often seen or heard of. Can help us perhaps understand some of this classical Maya imagery. Maya women ritual assistants offering the participants cups. Note they wear the same type of special garments with these concentric circles we'll see. Here perhaps is a noble woman about ready to begin to serve as a ritual attendant because there is some type of a fermented drink offered there. Women pose and drink and engage in these things. Notice that there's a god En figure, a Pawatun, also one of the Musum Kabs. The East version of the Pawatun is a bee god. And we'll see this too later in Chalamba books. So the old gods, the Bakabs, drinking with women, assistants and attendants behind them, wearing characteristic concentric circle symbols, these women on their garments. It's very similar to what the Lacandon do. Lacandon shaman wearing red paint on the body of dress, bark twisted bands on his headband, just like the gods of the myths of creation. A possible impersonation of the goddess Ishchebelyash or her consort Itzamna. The use of these concentric circles painted on their faces, on their garments. Note the use of even rattles. A 1974 Balcha ritual witnessed by a anthropologist wrote, the officiant and assistants painted 2 red circles with a dot in the center on the posts and beams, like we saw in the previous ceramic pot, as the god censers are placed on the side facing east, red. According to Davis, the Hachwinik, the Lacandon, believe that these decorations are transmitted to the houses of the gods. This is the conduit through which you communicate and offer to the gods. Symbols on the pots and the women's garments are echoed in the Lacandon ceremony. The same concentric circle with a dot in the center are painted on the gourd and the balche jars and other ritual objects. Finally, an assistant paints identical circles on the tunic of the celebrant at the chest height. They also paint 3 red lines around the right wrist and the right ankle of the celebrant. Then the celebrant and all participants painted a red dot on their forehead and one on their chin, as had been done to the effigy censers. And they splashed their tunic with red dots immediately. The heart level, probably imitating a heart extraction, but the offering was made beautiful. A scene similar to what is occurring in a 1674 Maya noble drinking fest, where a woman serves as a ritual assistant, is actually shown to us on a classic Maya pot, where gods, the Pawatunis and the Chaks, are assisted by women wearing this imagery and drinking. Notice that there will also be music. These celebrations, especially those for the goddess and for honey, always use drums and rattles. They have a type of handed drum, a hollow wood with heavy and sad sound. These drums show up in Maya idolatry rituals as well as in the ceramics. We see that in 1670s, there is one of these. Testimony said, I heard him say many times that their guards who were angry and that they needed offerings of balche. And in doing this, they also danced and they sang a dance they called pocho and others tsulam. To join this adoration, they played first a small instrument of their nation. That was the sign they made for all to come and join the said drinking ceremony and feast. And they played this on the tunkun. It's a type of drum, tunku or pash, rattles, zulum posh, it's called. This dance, pocho or poch. The celebrant who led the music of the festival was called the Holpop. Diego Lopez de Cogullo confiscated and arrested one. They have one principal singer who sets the key and teaches what the necessary to sing. This man they venerate and respect and give him a title. He is called Holpop, and it is to his care the drums or tunkulas are entrusted. We have here a hand drum of ceramics, ceramic drum, pash. We have here someone with gourd rattles, tzot, tuch or tzot, a type of rattle the Indians made for their dances. Rattles and drums are always present in drinking rituals. And we see that this figure behind them, who's not playing an instrument, but wears a mitre like a priest, could possibly be the whole pop of this ceremony. There is a bird, and we see noted that in many of these rituals, people are wearing bird masks or they have bird headdresses. There's a bird called Chipkoch Pochoch Ave Agüero, they give augurios de la gentilidad de los indios, que se alimenta de abejas. This bird eats bees. The dance was the dance on stilts with a bird mask. They danced the dance of the bee-eating bird. There's even a mulatto in the 1690s who's caught doing this.
John,
Yes?
sorry to interrupt. You're 20 minutes over time, and we need to speed up. So if you can,
I'm almost done.
Go towards the conclusions.
There we are right at the conclusions now. I'll go right through.
Great, thank you.
There is a mulatto who is discovered being the Holpop, charged with the tunkul and leading these dances. So we can look and see that what we will learn from this iconography, what we can see from the ceramic imagery of effigy censers, what we can tease out of the idolatry trials that give us ethnographic and religious information, is that women, noble women, played an important role even in the colonial period inside the home in these drinking rituals. They prepared the ritual libations, but things were gradually changing. In conclusion, as balche bark became more scarce, as it was persecuted, as honey became a necessary tribute payment and increased in its demands, there was less honey, less balche bark. It became more dangerous to conduct these rituals. So they became more clandestine. Public rituals disappeared, which meant that women began to play, especially noble women, a larger role as everything moved inside. And we'll see that younger women will complain of the burden of having to prepare these things, like Ines Tzul in 1598. There'll be other cases where the women denounced it. Young women denounced these rituals because they didn't want to have to get up in the middle of the night to make these rituals. In the end, we see that times were changing, but they never gave up the necessity, the use, and the drinking of these ritual libations. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. Great talk as always. And sorry that I interrupted you, but
I was almost at the end anyway.
Yeah, good. So we are 20 minutes over time. So, and we need to do a tech check during the break. We have 15 minutes more or less. We can maybe have one quick question.
Yeah, we have time for one or two questions.
Yeah. So there's one in the Q&A by Hyuntai. Does the term suyulha relate to suyua in Popol Vuh and Chilambalam? If it is possible, could you explain the etymology of suyalha briefly?
Yes, I would argue that Suya, the language of Suya, some scholars, even Ralph Royce, thought that it actually was a place of origin. But I believe, because of what's contained in it, what the clandestine analogies are talking about, that it probably comes from the origin of purity. It is the pure language that the chiefs must know if they are true Maya men, Hahil Mayawinik, if they know how to plant the balche, how to use it in rituals. So everything is a metaphor veiled, but it all has to do with forbidden ritual knowledge that had to be preserved clandestinely. And the purity of their ritual knowledge was what would gain and maintain them as the true leaders, as the Balamot, because these chieftains called themselves the protectors of their towns. Balamot, they were the jaguar protectors, and they were protecting not physically the town, but its religion and its culture and its practices. So I think that this Tsuya is from Suhui, from more purity and virginity and fresh purity than it is a place name meaning Central Mexican origins, because the language is all about these ritual metaphors.
Yeah, so who is interesting because in the Motul it's translated as virgen, but obviously we need to go beyond that Spanish term and understand what it means and meant exactly in pre-Columbian times.
And for other Maya groups like Kekchis or Itzas, exactly.
Yeah, maybe Alan can also address the issue regarding Popol Vuh during his talk. But thank you again, John. Great talk.